I was sitting at the far end of a table of 30 people when my mother said it the way she said most devastating things. Casually mid-conversation. The way you mention the weather or the price of something at the market, not lowering her voice, not checking who was listening. Not looking at my daughter Lily, who was 10 years old and sitting close enough to hear every single word, and what she said was, "Lily is a sweet girl, but honestly, she is just a lot. You know how some children are just too much to handle." And she said it to my Aunt Carol, who nodded with the comfortable agreement of a woman who had never had to handle. Lily, who had spent perhaps 4 hours total in my daughter's presence, and I watched my aunt nod, and I watched my mother continue talking, and I watched Lily's face across the table do something I'd been watching it do her entire life, which was receive a wound and immediately begin the work of pretending it had not arrived. And I thought, I know that face. I have been making that face since I was younger than you are now. And something in me that had been patient for a very long time stopped being patient. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you the whole story because the dinner table moment is only the end of a much longer story, a story that started long before Lily was born, that started when I was a child sitting at a different table learning for the first time that some people's love has a volume limit, that there is a threshold of need and feeling and presence beyond which you stop being a beloved child and start being an inconvenience someone is managing, and I crossed that threshold early and often, and spent the better part of my childhood and adolescence trying to pull myself back below it, trying to become the quieter, smaller, easier version of Sarah that might finally fit inside the space my mother had available. I was 9 when the panic attacks started, though I did not know what they were. I knew only that sometimes my body staged emergencies without consulting me, that my chest would close and my hands would go strange, and the air in whatever room I was in would suddenly seem insufficient, and they came most reliably in situations where I could feel my mother's patience thinning, in the moments when I could read in the set of her shoulders or the particular flatness of her voice that I had once again been too much too loud, too emotional, too persistently myself, and my body had learned to anticipate those moments with its own private alarm system, learned to flood itself with panic before the verdict even arrived, as if rehearsing the impact might somehow soften it. My sister Nicole was 2 years younger and quieter by nature, not performing quietness the way I learned to perform it, but genuinely constitutionally a person who moved through the world at a lower volume, and my mother found her easier, and I do not blame Nicole for this, because Nicole did not choose to be easier any more than I chose to be harder. We were simply born different, and one of those differences happened to fit my mother's available space and one did not, and I spent years looking sideways at my sister, trying to identify what she had that I could borrow, what I could adjust in myself to produce the same ease in my mother's face that Nicole produced without trying. The thing about growing up as the too much child is that you get very good at reading rooms, at scanning for signs of your own excess before anyone has to tell you, and this skill is useful in certain professional contexts, and quietly devastating in personal ones because it means you are never fully present anywhere. You are always also monitoring, always running the calculation of how much of yourself is currently safe to show, and I carried this skill into adulthood and into motherhood, and I was carrying it still the night of the dinner table when my mother called my daughter too much to handle in front of 30 people. Lily is not actually too much to handle. Lily is curious and loud and emotionally present and persistent in the way of children who have been raised to believe their feelings are worth expressing, and I raised her that way deliberately, with the specific intention of raising a child who did not spend her evenings pressing her back against cold walls, counting her own breath while her family ate dinner downstairs, and I had done a reasonably good job of this. Lily was confident in a way I had not been at 10. Was willing to take up space in a way I had spent my whole childhood apologizing for, and it was precisely this confidence, this willingness, this unapologetic presence that my mother looked at across the dinner table and called too much to handle. I did not respond immediately. I have learned over a lifetime of managing my mother that immediate responses produce worse outcomes than measured ones, that the impulse to react in the moment is often the impulse that she will later use to confirm that I am too emotional, too sensitive, too much, and so I sat with it. I let the dinner continue. I watched Lily's face recalibrate itself into fine the way I had taught my own face to recalibrate into fine at exactly her age. And I felt something break open in me watching that, something that had been intact through years of managing my own pain, but could not survive watching my daughter learn the same management. In the car on the way home, I asked Lily how she was and she said fine in the specific tone of fine that means the opposite. And I said, "You heard what Grandma said?" And she was quiet for a moment and then she said yes. And I said, "I want to tell you something true about that." And she turned to look at me and I said, "Grandma said that because she has a limited amount of space inside her for people who feel things fully, and you feel things fully. And that is not a flaw in you, it is a limitation in her." And Lily was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Did she say that about you too when you were little?" And I said, "Yes, in different ways." For a long time and she said, "And are you okay?" And I said, "I am okay." And she said, "Good," and turned to look out the window. And that was the whole conversation, but it was also the most important conversation I've ever had because it was the first time I had told my daughter the truth about what my childhood had been, rather than the smoothed over version I had been offering her as protection. The call I made to my mother 3 days later was not a screaming match, was not the dramatic confrontation that the situation might seem to call for. It was a quiet and direct conversation in which I said, "Mom, what you said about Lily at the dinner was something I heard and something she heard, and I need you to understand that I am not going to bring her to environments where that happens." And my mother said, "Sarah, I was just making conversation." And I said, "I know you think that." And she said, "You are being oversensitive again." And I said, "I have been being oversensitive again my entire life, and I have decided to stop apologizing for it." And there was a long silence. And then my mother said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means that Lily and I will not be at Christmas this year. We will not be at the Easter gathering. We will not be available for the large family occasions where she is likely to hear herself described as too much by the person who is supposed to make her feel like enough." And my mother said, "You are being dramatic," and I said I'm being her mother, and I ended the call. The months that followed were not simple, and I will not dress them as simple. There were calls from my aunt Carol and calls from Nicole, who was caught in the middle and did not want to be. And there were letters from my mother that arrived in the careful handwriting she used when she was trying to be taken seriously, and I read the letters unlike some people in some stories because I needed to know what she was actually thinking rather than what I was imagining she was thinking. And what the letters said surprised me. They said less of what I expected and more of something else. They said things like, "I did not realize the pattern you are describing, but I am trying to see it. And I spoke to Nicole and she helped me understand some things. And I know I have not always made you feel like enough, and I am not sure I know how to fix that, but I would like to try." I did not rush back. Lily and I had a good Christmas, just the two of us and my husband. David and Lily made cookies, and we watched films, and she did not spend the day monitoring anyone's face for signs of her own excess. And watching her that day, I thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. This is the thing I was trying to build when I decided to raise a child who takes up her full space. It has been 14 months now. Lily sees my mother occasionally in small settings, in contexts where I am present and where the 30 relatives are not, and my mother is trying, which is an imperfect and uncomfortable and genuinely real thing to watch. She is trying to sit with Lily the way Lily actually is, rather than the quieter version she would find easier, and sometimes she manages it, and sometimes she falls back into old patterns, and I see it happen, and I say something quietly and directly. And my mother hears it with varying degrees of grace depending on the day. Lily asked me last month if Grandma loved her, and I said yes. "Grandma loves you," and Lily said, "Then why did she say that?" And I said, "Because loving someone and understanding how to show it are two different skills, and Grandma is still learning the second one." And Lily considered this and then said, "That's kind of sad." And I said, "Yes, it is kind of sad." And she said, "I hope she figures it out." And I thought, me too. I have been hoping that my whole life, and for the first time in a very long time, the hoping felt less like waiting for something that would never arrive and more like genuinely believing it might, which is not the same as certainty but is so much better than nothing that I am choosing to call it enough.